All right, guys, if you've joined me for this episode, tonight we're going to talk about e-commerce and the future of e-commerce and what to expect going forward from 2019 and into the next year and a half or so. So right recently there's been some huge changes, and I've seen some trends that are happening that I think that people might start getting stuck in kind of a whirlpool and not moving forward. I also see some traps that might hit a dead end. It might hit a wall coming up moving forward. So I was thinking about just creating a quick video to kind of bullet point some things out, but I really don't think that I can satisfy giving someone a full idea about what the future is going to hold in e-commerce unless I split this up into a couple of parts. So for those of you who are considering creating an e-commerce store as maybe a side income or possibly something that you can grow to replace your employment, these are still at this time sustainable models of self-employment and business development. I'm not sure that this is going to go away anytime soon, although some people are kind of doomsy about it. What I do know is that some types of e-commerce and selling platforms tend to have fads and trends, and sometimes those platforms will hit a dead end. Now, I've been doing e-commerce as my sole form of self-employment for the last 15 years. I actually created an e-commerce store in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, turned it into a huge brick and mortar store, had $500,000 in inventory sitting in my store with customers coming and going and several employees. I mean, I built it out into a huge retail store. And I've done other types of e-commerce and used other types of models as time has rolled along. And there are some things that have caught my attention in regard to sales pitches that people have offered as to what would be a successful moving forward. And I don't know if it's really possible to appreciate a prediction of future trends if you haven't been around from the beginning and you haven't seen the cycles and the trends of the fads that have already happened in the last decade. So when young kids come up and they've learned a model on Amazon FBA that does work and that they can be successful on, it's exciting and it's great when they want to reach out and they want to share that model and they want to teach other people how to do it. But it feels like they haven't hit that end of the cycle wall yet, to where they don't know when the end of that trend would be coming and they wouldn't be able to kind of get out of the way or adapt or start creating a second backup plan before that all ends. You see this over and over again. We saw it in trends with eBay in the mid-2000s. We're kind of starting to see it now in waves of Amazon FBA sellers. You've got groups of people that come in, they work really hard, they do everything they're supposed to, and then they kind of fall off the edge, or they get burnt out, really is what happens. And then new younger waves come in and they adapt the model and they kind of learn the algorithm of how to manipulate it a little bit so they can climb on top, and then that lasts for a little while and then the algorithm catches up, and it's a cycle that happens over and over again. And we've seen a change in technology, and we've also seen a change in the type of consumerism that we see on the internet. Right now you have more shoppers. You have kind of a larger number of technical laymen who are able to access and use the internet for shopping. Whereas 10 years ago, people tended to be a little bit more tech savvy, or they had a tendency to be in a population that was a different type of a shopper. So these things affect the trends as time goes on. So I think what I'm going to do, in order to really try to explain what you can expect moving forward in e-commerce in 2019 going in, I think I'm going to break this up into a few videos so that I'm not just hitting bullet points in a shallow way, but I can try to give you an overall understanding and some of the history of trends that we've seen in the past so you can see what we're going to predict in the future. So I think where I'll start is with eBay and try to explain how eBay was destroyed. Back in the early to mid-2000s, you had a crop of entrepreneurs who were focused on retail, just regular consumer products. Before that, you had a different type of people who were excelling and doing well on the internet as far as getting into their own businesses and being self-employed. And those people were programmers, people who would write in tech, people who were developing certain type of niches and genres on the internet that really propelled the internet forward, if you know what I'm talking about. But in the mid-2000s, that was when consumerism started to happen on the internet, because that's when shopping carts started to become available. They weren't fully functional or fully available right at that point, but you did have the eBay platform, which is where everybody kind of sort of filtered in. Now, those of you who are not old enough to remember, eBay started off as a kitschy thing that you would post something that you found in your garage and you would sell little things on the side, almost as if you were having a yard sale. And that was fun, and it was novelty, and it was a way for people to have a good time and interact with the internet. It was kind of the very, very first time that we saw people who would have a Pavlovian response to bells and followers and whistles and pokes and those types of things. And you would recognize that more frequently in Twitter and Facebook now, when you're waiting for a message to come through and you hear a buzz or a ding, or when you're getting likes on a photo that you post, you have this sort of euphoric, addictive quality to it. Well, eBay was the first one where that happened to people. And so you would have people flocking and migrating to eBay. It became a huge corporation, and soon enough you had shareholders that the company had to impress and please. Now, by mid-2000s, a certain group of people, in the thousands perhaps, were able to figure out how to successfully generate an income and create essentially an e-commerce retail store from their eBay platform. eBay started to see that this was working, and they got really interested. Their shareholders were especially interested because this was really driving the business of eBay, with these people who were creating listing after listing after listing. And it kind of became a science, the way you would saturate the listings in a cycle of time. And of course, you'd have to pay more money in order to do that. And this was really a generating profit for eBay. So what they discovered was that they were going to gear their platform toward stores and retailers. And then that way they were going to really promote these people who were funneling their money into eBay with their listing fees and their final value fees. And it became something more than just you selling an old lamp out of your garage. Well, it didn't take more than a year or two before some of those stores floated to the top, and you had people who were doing 6 and 7 digits a year, or they were just turning a consistent profit from their eBay retail sales. So they would find something wildly successful, and they would just repeat it over and over and over, like a cycle, like a hamster wheel, over and over again. And this worked very well. And over some time, multiple people started to discover that this worked very well, and they started to come in and saturate that niche. And before you know it, you had cookie cutter stock photos of the same drop shipped items over and over and over again, and the entire platform was saturated with the same men's leather jacket or the same Canon 360D or whatever was popular at that time. And to cull the overpopulated listings, eBay came up with a clever idea. They raised the fees on just about everything for stores. Store owners started to pay a lot more, and the final value fees went up. At one point, the final value fees of an eBay listing was about 20 or 25% of your entire profit margin, which is incredible. So they would couch it in a wording that sounded like you were only paying an 8% final value fee. But that's the final percent of the cost of the total item. So after you deduct all the additional fees, all of your store listings, the cost of your inventory, the cost of shipping it out there, eBay is really a business partner. They're not really just a third party that's charging you a fee. They're a business partner. Now, not every store could sustain these types of profit margins, so the weakest of the cull started to kind of drop off, and you had the strongest stores float to the top. Then their system became a little bit more decayed when they implemented something along the lines of a change in their review system, to where the customers could exploit the sellers by letting them know that if they weren't getting an extra deal, or if they didn't have some kind of a negotiated price, that they were going to give them a decreased review. And oftentimes, like myself, I would often be extorted. I would be contacted by the customers after they received their goods, and without a complaint, or with something that I could easily rectify for them. And instead of just trying to have a simple exchange, they would extort me for a review. And this happened once in a while, but it was enough to be an annoying part of the business. Then they started to create an algorithm that would sync people that didn't have the best reviews. So now your smaller businesses who are struggling to stay in business were going to suffer even more. And on top of that, your competitors could negatively affect you by purchasing from you and just all out giving you a bad review. So this constant police state mentality was deteriorating the health of the free market business, essentially. Then something very drastic happened. eBay started to make deals with China. In order to be allowed to run its business in China, they had to negotiate that the Chinese people, when they wanted to make their listing, they didn't have to pay a listing fee. Matter of fact, it was free for them to list, and I don't even know what the fees would be, greatly reduced than anything that we would pay here in the United States. And they could list multiple items over and over and over again. So for every one listing that I would have to pay 20 or 30% of my entire profit margin to eBay in order to sell on their platform, someone in China could list 10 for free. Well, you can imagine this would destroy businesses going forward. I even had someone who saw my eBay store posted online contact me at one point claiming to be a wholesaler in China. They sent me photos of identical items that I had already purchased and told me that they could make me those children's clothing for a lesser price and bulk ship them over to me, and that they could prove that these items were a great quality and send me photos immediately. And it turned out that the photos that they sent me were my very own photos that I had worked so hard to create and had posted online over at my website. They just ganked those photos right off the internet, sent them to me, and told me that those were photos from their manufacturer's studio, and if I would like to purchase, by the way, from eBay. So they wanted to know if I wanted to purchase from them as my competitor on my own selling platform with the photos that I personally took of my inventory. Well, back in the mid-2000s, thousands of retailers were smashed out of the platform. And it's no surprise. The prices got too high, the competition was ridiculously diluted, and it just became too difficult to make any money. Now, that's not to say that it wouldn't have happened anyway, and that's not to put blame anywhere else. eBay is its own business, and it has to try different models to see what's going to work, and they're kind of the first guy in the game, so how do they know what's going to work unless they try it out? It was very clear that eBay did not have its seller in its best interest. It had itself in its best interest. Now, by the time I decided to leave eBay and go out into the internet on my own, I was regularly making $20,000 a week in sales revenue from that platform. And that sounds great, but $20,000 a week broke down into 50% inventory, a portion of that into shipping, and 20% of my entire profit was going over just for the listing fees. That didn't include the final value fees. At the end of it all, I was spending about $10,000 or $11,000 a week in inventory and shipping, and $7,000 a week was going directly to eBay to cover the fees of running these listings. I think at the time I was running about 300 listings a day. I had to run a listing every 5 minutes in order to stay on the front page of the auctions that were rolling through. So I think I was running about 300 listings a day times 7 days a week, and I had to pay for every single one of those listings. And out of those listings, about 1 out of 10 would sell. So I had to pay for 10 listings for every one item that would sell. Now, with the nature of capitalism, you would say you have to work those prices into your final values, and that would be the cost of your item. But of course, it's a free market, so we have to be competitive with the guy next to us who is selling the same thing. So we have to keep it somewhere down in the middle, and that's just how it works. So after averaging an income of $20,000 a week, I was pocketing about $1,800. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. I was doing a great job. It was solid work. It was consistent. But at the end of the day, the house wins, and eBay was the house. Now, incrementally, over the course of about a year, those numbers started to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it wasn't just me. It was everyone on the eBay forums, people out in the world. We didn't have Facebook at the time. I don't think we had MySpace groups or anything like that back then. We just had internet forums that we would find on little BB forums that people would write. But this was a trend, and it was happening to a lot of sellers, and people ended up abandoning that platform. If you go onto eBay right now, and you could still, even now, put up a lamp from your garage and it might sell, but it's just not the animal it used to be. And most people know that. If you've been into e-commerce for a while, you know your shoppers are on Amazon. They're not so much on eBay anymore, but your sellers have abandoned that ship a long time ago. And that's sort of what I see happening with Amazon and Amazon FBA coming up in the future. And so we've got these crops of Amazon FBA sellers and also people that like to sort of teach that method. And those methods do change. They evolve over time as Amazon has to deal with people who manipulate their algorithm so that they can crawl up on top, and then they have to combat that, just like every search engine does. Google's been doing it for decades. Yahoo, back when it was alive, it had to try to do that as well. So it's not a surprise that you get waves of people who get excited about selling on platforms like Amazon and doing Amazon FBA because they discover a loophole or they discover something in the moment that's a trend that's very successful. I saw this past year with the Shopify stores, when all of a sudden everyone could just pop up an e-commerce store and you had to have really no skill. You could use a few apps that you could download on your phone to help you out with creating these stores that in the past you would have to be a technical engineer in order to do. And people are doing excellent on some of these stores, but this is a fad and it is a trend, and you can't sustain the model when everyone jumps in. By the time everybody figures it out, it's just like the stock market. If everyone's buying the stock, then you know it might be time. Now, eBay and Amazon are two entirely different models, so they don't completely equate, and they are not run the same way. But the pattern that we can identify here is that they do tend to move in waves of trends. And what you find successful in one platform will have its moment, and then you'll have to adapt. The only thing that you know for sure is that you're going to have to adapt in order to keep that model going. So the Amazon system as it is right now is moving along quite strong. People are doing excellent on that system. Some people are struggling, and there's really no guarantee that you're going to break out and do terrific. It's really hard work, and like retail and also computer technology, selling on the internet is a science. What you do is you find the guy who's succeeding and you just copy that, and you don't deviate, you just copy that thing over and over again. So the warning I would take away from watching the fade and cycle and trend of eBay, how it came up over the course of 10 years and then crashed, was to just be aware that these types of very successful models and platforms, they're not forever. And you have to be prepared to adapt. And if you really want to stay in the game, you have to stay in the game. I can't imagine that there is anybody out there who realistically thinks that they can start up an Amazon FBA store because their dream was to sit on a beach in Fiji and that that's all they're going to do, and they're just going to kind of check in on Thursdays at 4. I can't imagine that person could, even if they got lucky, stay in the game, because you always have to be one step ahead, paying attention to what the next trend in technology or what the next loophole in the algorithm is, so that you can stay on top of the guy who's coming up behind you. Because I promise you, for every one guy who sees you doing well, there's 3 behind you who are striving to take your spot. That's just how it is. So the message for tonight's story would be, all of those who experienced that eBay Armageddon, who were already doing 6 and 7 figures that the newbies are bragging and excited about now, understand that these things come in cycles. And don't be surprised if the cycle comes up and it goes down again in the future. We have to be aware of that, and you have to prepare yourself to always be adaptable.